Hello everybody to this week's episode of Storytime. My name is Charlie Malone, and every week I try to bring you a story that you will enjoy and maybe learn something from. This week, the story is called Earthworm, and it's by an author and an illustrator that I was not familiar with, so I did some further research and I discovered some incredible things about the author, Andrienne Souter-Perrot, and even more importantly by the illustrator, Ettienne Delessert. So if you go to my website, you can read about some of the things I discovered about them. It's fascinating. But let's see what this story is about. What is it? An earthworm is a very small animal. When the ground is wet, you may see one crawling along a country lane or in the grass. There's a country lane. A worm's body is very long and thin. It is formed by many little ring-like segments. Those are the ring-like segments. A worm looks the same on both ends, but in fact it has a mouth in front and a small hole in back. You should maybe after you finish listening to the story, go out and find yourself some worms, because there's some other differences between the front and the back of a worm, but I'm sure you can figure them out if you hold the worm carefully and look at it move. An earthworm is moist and cool to the touch. An earthworm is both male and female, but it still needs to mate with another worm before it can lay eggs. That is very interesting and something to think about. So a worm is both a boy and a girl. If a worm accidentally gets cut in two, the halves can go on living if there are enough segments left. Each half may grow into a whole worm again. This is called regeneration. Some worms do that and some don't. But be careful with the worms that you touch and play with. So, where do worms live? A worm never lies out in the sun. They'd get dried up too fast. During the day, worms stay deep in the earth, sheltered from the sun's heat and light. And at night, when the air is cool and damp, the worms come up to the surface. So there the worms are underneath the ground during the day, because they would get dried out in the sun. And then at night, in the cooler weather, they come up out of their holes to eat. You won't find worms on paved city streets, but sometimes you'll find them on the sidewalk. You might see worms in your garden or in a park. In a field, you might find more than 500 worms in a square yard of soil. It's an interesting picture. It represents what it might look like, a square yard of soil, if you could just somehow see that under the ground. Well, a lot of times there's a lot more worms in the ground than we think of. You might find thousands of worms in a compost heap where grass clippings and garden waste turn into new soil. I know that in our compost bin at school, we have lots of earthworms. And notice in this picture, there's a hedgehog. And that's because this book was written by a person who lived in Europe, where hedgehogs are one of the animals that live in the neighborhood. How do worms help us? Are worms of any use to us? Well, worms slither between rocks and clods of dirt. They're slithering. Where the soil is packed down hard, the worms dig out little tunnels, swallowing the soil as they move on. The tunnels let air and water into the ground, helping plants to grow. So these worms make these tunnels in the earth that let water and air move through the soil. The worms digest the earth they have eaten, leaving behind droppings of finely sifted soil. These droppings, called worm casts or castings, make excellent food for growing plants. You can see the little mounds of worm castings, and this is a fun thing to look for. Be on the lookout for little worm castings, because even if you can't see any worms, you can see the worm castings and you know they are there. The worm castings are the worm poop. But don't worry, it's very clean. It's the best kind of dirt. Like a farmer plowing a field, earthworms invisibly till the soil, breaking it up and leaving it finer. As the worms tunnel underground, they carry bits of grass and leaves with them. There's a farmer tilling the soil, digging it up, turning it over. And what this story is telling us is that the worms do that on their own scale, just naturally. The bits of plants and grass start to rot. Eventually, they turn into dark, rich powder in the earth called humus. All plants need humus, water, and air to grow. The worms help bring the plants what they need. I wonder what that is growing in the ground. How can we help worms? Well, worms enrich the soil, so how can we help the worms? Well, they are food for birds, frogs, and many other animals. Good gardeners know that worms should not be destroyed or killed. They use gardening tools that will not hurt the worms. That's interesting. That's a pitchfork. And so instead of, sometimes when you use shovels, you can accidentally cut up the worms, and a pitchfork is less likely to do that. Good gardeners also are careful about using chemicals that might harm worms or the animals that eat them. So we would never want to spray poisons of any kind on our gardens, because the poisons might, they might hurt the plants, they might hurt the worms, the other animals, the earth. So we only use organic things to put on our gardens. And we have to look and see what other farmers put on the plants and vegetables that they grow. Healthy fields, woods, and gardens always contain plenty of hard-working worms. Here's a nice healthy garden. So I hope you enjoyed this story about worms. I love the pictures. There's a lot of other really great worm books that I will list on my website that you can check out for yourself. But then even better, go find some worms, investigate them, explore them, play with them. Have a great week, and I'll see you outside.